Okay, welcome to Chapter 6. We're going to be looking at the social emotional development of children. And I know that last lecture was quite lengthy, but I think we had some really important information in that, and I hope that you really got a lot out of it, because there's so many factors that we need to look at. And when we start looking at things just on the surface, it really doesn't give us enough information to understand what is fully going on. So I know I went a little bit more in depth on some of the things, and I asked you to look at different areas, but I really think that that was worthwhile. So let's go on to look at the social emotional aspects of development in children. And when we talk about these things, we've already talked about nutrition, we've already talked about how it affects growth, we've talked about ADD and ADHD, and when we look at any one of these, I know they have a topic, as far as social emotional development or physical development, but I really want you to have the mindset that one affects the other, and that all of these things are integrated, that there is no compartmentalizing them. We can understand them, say, from a physical viewpoint or from a social emotional viewpoint, but a lot of them really influence one another, and so these factors, we have to look at them as a holistic view. So let's look at setting the challenge of the social emotional setting. And just as we have an IQ, we also have what's called an EQ. And what this has to do with is our emotional regulation, which is the capacity to manage one's emotional state. So maturing in the frontal lobe is happening, and this is what contributes to the development of self-regulation abilities. And so again, we can probably think back to when we talked about how some children might mature a little bit faster than others, or they might be able to roll over earlier, but then they don't walk as quick. And so this is really the same thing too, because we have a lot of growth development going on in the brain that has to do with biological factors. So something else to consider too, that children will develop a self-regulation pattern depending on their growth in their brain. So again, things that we can't always see. So it's important for social and emotional success. So basically, when we talk about an EQ, or this emotional regulation or emotional quotient, is that really it's the ability for one to gauge their own emotions and to discriminate, and to see how other people's emotions affect them too. And so they're really looking at, and when I talk about discriminate, is to look at what emotion might be acceptable in one particular situation and not in another. So, if a little kid, and generally at the age of 2, and you've probably all seen this at some point, that children are playing and they all look like they're happy, and one kid finds a really cool looking toy, and so he goes over and he whacks his friend on the head with the toy. And then when the child starts crying, the little boy looks confused because he's not really understanding, why is this other child crying? I'm just coming over and this is a cute toy and I wanted to share it. And so I was trying to give it to him and now he's crying. And so they don't understand the response. They don't understand, oh, I've hurt another child, and so I should feel, bad or sad inside. So, again, this is just kind of bringing to light and kind of demystifying some of these areas that when you see, a child of the age of 2 who just kind of randomly might be doing something and it seems a little bit odd, we're starting to see that they might be reacting, but if they don't react in a way that you think is quote unquote normal, that really what's happening here is that they're starting to regulate their emotions and they're starting to understand what emotions mean. So why are these important and important for us to understand? Well, really, it adds to the social successes. In other words, children have to learn to be able to regulate their emotions, to be able to know, what is good in one situation or what should I be feeling in a situation, to really be able to have those good, solid social relationships. And what we find a lot of time when we look at some of the problematic, the temperamental tendencies, is that we have one which is externalizing or internalizing. When we look at externalizing, what we generally see with these children is that they have impulse aggression. And so, on the other hand, it can also be internalizing, which might be social inhibition or fear or sadness, where they take all of their emotions in within them. And so we really want to make sure that when we look at these different emotions, that we understand kind of what's normal as far as what we should be seeing in growth and development. And then if a child is very highly aggressive, that this might be out of the purview of what we would consider to be in normal parameters. So we really start to see that these children start to experience their world on a very emotional level too. They might start to engage in really, having friends and really liking friends. And then if their friend gets hurt or falls down and starts to cry, they might come over and pat their friend on the head, and they're trying to comfort them. And so this is really all a part of their emotional development. And when we look at going back to our good friend Piaget, let me get him up here, is looking at the concrete operational stage. And this is when personality and the emerging self comes into play. In other words, how they start thinking about themselves and understanding their inner state. So the children become less egocentric, and we talked about that, how everything seems to revolve around them. And when they start to understand others and have different perspectives other than their own. In other words, they can consider somebody else's perspective. So instead of saying, hey, I want to go out on the playground and I want to go play in the sandbox, and their friend says, I really don't want to do that, I don't want to get my shoes dirty, then they might say, I understand that, and okay, why don't we just go and walk around? And so they start feeling what maybe other people are feeling, and they start to take that on. So that's pretty important because they're starting to gauge. And remember, we talked about that give and take, that barter system of, yes, I have to give a little bit and I expect other people to give a little bit. So they're really starting to understand that they have the power to do that. And so that they no longer believe that they are the center of the universe. And that, of course, that comes back in the teen years, though. So they become more self-aware, and they self-reflect and compare themselves to others. So this is also a very important stage of comparing themselves to others. And so what can we expect? Well, let's look at a little bit of research here. With the Susan Harder's research, is that it changes, self-awareness is changing. And at about the age of 3 years old, the self-description focuses on external factors. So what we can expect to see as we move down the line is that they're starting to look at things and gauge themselves and the external factors as far as gauging themselves to their cohort, to their peers, to the people that they play with on the playground. And so really what we can see at about maybe 4th grade, or the 4th graders, is that there's a self-description or internal and psychological, and it's anchored in feelings, ability, and inner traits. So they're starting to come to know who they are as a person. And so what do you think is very important? If they're starting to come to know themselves as a person, what's going to be very important in their life? What they think of themselves, right? Of course. So this is very important, how they see themselves. Because if they are nurtured to see themselves as not a good child or not a smart child, this is how they're going to come to start to know themselves. So generally around this age, self-esteem is starting to develop when they're evaluating oneself as either good or bad. Now this does decline during the early elementary school years though too. And so again, they're really just gauging themselves against what they see in others, what they've been told by others, maybe how others react to them, what teachers tell them. So this is a very, very important emotional, social-emotional development time for them. And then even if we take a deeper look at self-esteem, we can go back to Erikson, and this was the stage that we looked at as being either industry or inferiority. And what did Erikson say about industry and inferiority? Well, he said basically that children have the ability to work towards a goal, and they may feel inferior if they do not measure up. So self-esteem is based on the value the child places on a particular dimension or dimensions. And if we go back to Susan Harder's work, there are actually 5 different dimensions. And this is the people skills, their ability to relate to others, the ability to make friends, the ability to barter, to have that good bartering system, politeness, their intellectual ability, appearance, and physical ability. Now remember, this is all how these individuals are gauging themselves, how they see themselves in the world. And so how are they coming up a lot of times with these different, the different dimensions? And even if Susan Harder hadn't come up with all of this great research that we have, the fact is that discreetly, this is how children move throughout the world. They're gauging themselves against the little boy or the little girl that sits next to them. You know, what's their behavior like? Oh, they're sitting there. I'm kind of fidgeting. Maybe I should just sit here and wait. Everybody says that person is nice. What does that person do to be nice? Why would other people say that about that person and not about me? Oh, maybe if I help my friends out, or maybe if I help the teacher out, maybe I'll be seen as nice. So whatever it is that's going on in their brain, they're thinking and they're gauging themselves to their friends. So how do children actually see themselves? Oh, let me quickly put it. We've already seen this. So how do children see themselves? And this was part of Harder's questionnaire when she looked at it. And as you can see, we have the child on the left and then the child on the right. And so really when they asked children to kind of describe themselves, they put them in one of 2 of these different categories here. And so it says some kids often are unhappy with themselves, and it says this is sort of true about me, or this is really true for me. Some kids feel like they are just as smart as other kids. And so what it is with this scale is that it's trying to see how the child perceives themselves. Okay, so I have one more, so let me go back real quick here. One more to talk about this. Oh, I went forward. Whoops, that's previous. Here we go. So really we look at the idea that children can have these distortions about their self-esteem. And so what happens is they see these to be true. And they might be true in part, they might not be true in part, but whatever is their reality is what is very important. If their esteem is distorted, then what happens is they start to see themselves in a negative light. And so let's look at how these esteem distortions happen. So we talked about externalizing and internalizing problems and distortion and the consequences. So if we look at children with externalizing problems and esteem distortion, they might be acting out their emotions and their impulses, and often are very aggressive. So they may ignore problems and have an unrealistic high self-esteem. So interesting how even though they have these high impulses and aggression, that they do have very high self-esteem. And the consequence is that they continue to fail because they don't see a need to improve. In other words, they ignore the fact that that they need to maybe modify their behavior or to change something about themselves. And then children with internalizing problems, they're usually intensely fearful, and so they might be very withdrawn. And they can read failure into everything and have an overly low sense of self-esteem. And the consequence of this is that if they continue to fail because they decide that they cannot succeed, and then they just basically will stop even trying. And we're going to talk about this here in the upcoming slides. But so this is a real distortion, because here we have on one hand that a child might be not succeeding in the social world, but yet they might have very high esteem. And then we have on the other hand where a child maybe becomes very fearful of their environment or of other people. And so their esteem becomes very low because they don't feel like they fit in, or they don't feel like they can do whatever the task is. And sometimes what they end up doing is what's called minimizing and maximizing, where if they can't do one task, that they basically blanket it that they can't do any task at all. So it could be in art class that they couldn't paint a picture very well, or they weren't getting the right colors. And so instead of just saying, you know what, this is just a bad day, I'm not doing very well with this picture, maybe tomorrow will be better, they end up saying, you know what, I'm so dumb, I don't even know why I'm in school. And, you know, a lot of times this is exactly what happens when they start minimizing and maximizing. They will maximize the fact that they only had one failure, and then they'll minimize the fact that maybe they did have 10 successes in the past, but they don't look at those. So we've got to figure out, you know, how these distortions come into being, and how they really affect a child's development. So here we look at self-esteem and low self-esteem and the internalizing problems. So a lot of times they're overly self-critical, that they inflate or maximize, like I talked about, their failures, and they see failure when it doesn't even exist. And so it could be that they painted that picture and it was very good, and so the teacher gave them an A on it, and the student might say, you know what, the teacher must just be joking with me, and they gave me an A. And so they don't even see, or they don't even celebrate really true, honest, bona fide successes. And so this can also lead to learned helplessness too, is that they feel incapable of affecting the outcome of an event, and so they may just completely stop trying. So it might be, and you know, in this area a lot of times we see this where maybe a child has a learning difference and they're just not getting something, and instead of the teacher or the coach saying, you know what, let's try another way of doing it, let's see how we can get to where we want to be, that they keep telling them, just look at it, do it better, can't you understand it? And so they feel like they're very helpless, or that they don't have any control over it because they're not getting it. They don't have that pathway to get to the success that they need to help to feed their own esteem. And so they basically will just stop trying. And so, you know, it's common in those with internalizing problems that we see this, and we see a very low self-esteem. That a lot of times it has to do with their locus of control, and they don't feel like they have any control over it, so they might as well just give up. So again, a lot of times with the learned helplessness is that it is sometimes that there is no support available, and that there might even always be, you know, negative comments where a teacher says, well, she just doesn't get it. You know, I've told her, read the page, read the instructions. I've told her to read it 300 times and she just doesn't get it. Well, you know, the fact is that some people might learn by reading, whereas other people need to learn by either pictures or by hearing the instructions. And so it's the fact is that they need the support, and the support isn't there. Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit just about the different ways of identifying your esteem distortions, and I'm just going to go over a few of these here. So one could be academics, that when I get poor grades because my teachers don't give good tests or teach well, I have very little to learn from other people. I'm much smarter than practically everyone I know. So this could be associated with, what do you think? We talked about the two different externalizing and internalizing. Probably with externalizing. So it could also be something as like, let's see, what's another one? I don't think I have to work to improve my appearance because I'm basically gorgeous. So again, that could be something with a child that has externalizing issues or distortion. And then it could even be, I can't play basketball or any other sports because I couldn't even run around the track once. So what they do is they tend to take one failure and they tend to put that on everything else. All right, so let's look at, now that we've talked about how bad it is when they don't have esteem and that it does affect their growth and their development, let's look at what we can do about increasing that esteem. So how do we enhance that? Well, for one is that we want to enhance the self-efficacy, and we want to promote realistic self-esteem. And to enhance self-efficacy is the feeling of competence. I can succeed if I work hard. And notice when I just read that out, it says, I can succeed if I work hard. So what is that doing? That's telling the student, or a student that says this, feels a internal locus of control, that they have control over their environment, and if they do something, they are going to produce something. And it also be aware of Vygotsky's ZPD, just like we talked about. So in this is that we want to be able to praise the children, but I'm going to really caution against this, and I'm going to tell you about some work by Carol Dweck. And we do have her in one of our YouTube videos this week too. She does phenomenal work with mindsets and kids. Is that when a teacher understands that she needs to, or he, turn over control to the child, and in that zone of proximal development, it really is that area of really looking at the child's abilities. What do they know how to do? What can they run with? Where do they need a little bit of support? And how can I get them to continue to want to do well? Because this is another area where parents and educators and anybody involved in the process of child development really wants to perpetuate this. So let's look how we can do that. And it says here that we talk about realistic. Notice these words are involved. Realistic, self-esteem, and then praising the child's effort. So there's going to be a range of successes for children. And so we have to know how we are going to nurture that. And what Carol Dweck says is, she says, be careful of praise, because we can overpraise a child. So what is praise? Well, praise is maybe just good job or that's great. But if I tell a child who has just done a drawing or a painting of something, if I go up and I tell them that's great, great is pretty much at the top of the heap, isn't it? So where does the child go from great? So this is the biggest problem that Carol Dweck sees in basically praising children, is that we have to praise their effort. Because if we leave it open-ended, then the next time they try something, then even though it might be great too, they try it, it's just different to them. So in other words, instead of saying, that's a great picture, because now the child might go, oh my gosh, it is a great picture, and I'm not really a very good artist. I better never try again, because I probably will never do this good. So I only have down to go from great. So do you see how this starts to play into it on how we actually praise them? So we don't want to praise to perfection. So we don't want to say you are the best, you are totally gifted, you're the most gifted child I've ever seen. So we want to leave this open-ended. So how do we do that? We praise the effort. Wow, I see you have put a lot of work into this this art piece. How do you feel about it? I look forward to seeing more of your work. So do you see how this leaves it open-ended? So we can keep nurturing that, and we can keep supporting kids, but we always want to make sure that when we praise them, that it is promoting a perpetuation of the continued effort and continued success. Because then what they're saying now is, oh, wow, I do have control over this. And if I do work hard, I can do pieces that are interesting to me and that I can be proud of. So we want to promote the realistic aspect of it and to set realistic goals. If a child fails then we gently give them feedback. In other words, if you ask a child, what is, 5 times 6? And the child says, oh, I know that one, it's 25. And instead of saying, no, you're wrong, obviously you can't multiply, then we give them the gentle feedback. Okay, well, I see that you're getting your times tables, but let's go through that again. Let's look at that a different way. Let's do the 5s, and let's look at our fingers, and we're going to count by 5, and we're going to use 6 of our fingers. And then let's see if we're right on that answer. And then when they do it, and then they see that they're wrong, then they are the ones that, oh, I forgot one. Oh, okay, so we know it now. Because they feel a sense of control. So we let them know also that failure is part of success. And, I can relate this back a little bit just to my military experience. And I had, in the very end of my military experience, I had a very young troop come up to me and was very just kind of dumbfounded of that I could just do things very quickly and process through all of this stuff. And the troop said, wow, I'm scared to try to do what you do. I'll never be able to do it. How are you able to do that? And the very first thing that came out of my mouth was, because I know every wrong way to do something. And so we have to allow children to fail a little bit, to have to go back and to maybe have to look at things in a different perspective and let them know that failure is actually part of success. So another aspect of development is the social development, which we're going to look at next. I'm also going to put up some links here because in with this lecture this week, I think there's some really important things. We're talking about ADD and ADHD, which I know a lot of parents are interested in. We're talking about how can we praise kids to an open-ended and perpetuating self-efficacy and esteem. And so I have some really, really good support material. And I'm going to put that up on the website. I'll put it actually with these YouTube videos for you so that you do have them. Because I think that this is probably an area where a lot of you as parents or becoming parents or who are working with kids or will be working with kids will really be interested in this and want to read more. So I'll make sure that I do that for you. Okay, so let's go on and let's look a little bit about, let me see, am I on? One more is, I wanted to talk, let me go back real quick, I wanted to talk a little bit about the pro-social behaviors. And another aspect of development and social development is how individuals or how these children respond to others, their behaviors, because don't forget that even though we talked about the emotional side and having efficacy and self-esteem, that they're still playing off of one another. They're still gauging themselves and responding to one another. So we can also see this in the behaviors that they display. So where did we see how children learn how to have behaviors? Well, we talked a little bit about this in Piaget and with Erikson, but I think the really big theory that we learned about of where children learn particular behaviors a lot of times was from Bandura and the modeling. And so what they come to know as truths or acceptable or what is expected. And so this is really a lot of times where either other children are modeling or where parents are modeling or where teachers are modeling or the community is modeling all these different behaviors for them. So what they're doing is they're looking and they're saying, is that an acceptable behavior? Oh, somebody just cussed out another person and the person walked away from them and, doesn't want to be friends with them anymore. So that obviously, if I want to keep friends, probably cussing and swearing in their face isn't a good idea. So they're starting to understand these different behaviors. And we can see these pro-social behaviors in, are they sharing, are they helping, are they showing caring actions? And it appears as early as preschool and a little bit more frequently when we look at about the elementary school ages. And then really in elementary, it really starts to flourish and take off when they start to have these positive behaviors and we start to see altruism. In other words, like you might even see Ken Good drives at an elementary school where the kids have decided that maybe in a sister school that doesn't have a lot of the supplies that they have, that they want to donate supplies to them. They might be performing more selfless acts. I remember my daughter would come home and she would volunteer me to buy certain things, and she would say, Mom, some of the kids in the class don't have colored pencils, and so they have to use these ones that are about 1 inch long, and it's just really hard for them. Could you buy some packs of colored pencils so that we could bring them into school? And, so we start seeing them, how they start seeing how they can help other people and how they can be more pro-social. So really it is more of a non-egocentric reasoning. They start to look at what other people need. And so we want to really nurture these type of positive behaviors. Okay, so now we're going on to the interventions and the socialization with children to be pro-social. So how can we help them be pro-social? So basically, we can attend to your child's, and for teachers and educators out there, we can put in that we can attend to a child's pro-social behaviors. So, which is the attribute, the kind act to the child's personality. Attribute the kind act to the child's personality. In other words, they've decided to take it on themselves because it's part of them to want to do good for other people. So we might want to reinforce this altruistic behavior and display of sympathy and empathy. When a child comes home and says that, one of the kids in her class or his class, their dog died, instead of just blowing it off, is, asking them, well, is there something you would like to do for your friend to make them feel better? Maybe buy them a card, make them a card, and to really kind of support and reinforce this type of behavior. It's really nice to be nice to other people, because if this happened to you, I know that you would appreciate it too. And so then on the other hand of that, which we're going to look into, how do we, if they do have behaviors that we don't want to nurture, is that we want to intervene. But we don't want to be that authoritative or the authoritarian parent and tell them, you did this wrong or you did that wrong, because that also takes control right away from the child. And so really to use discipline using induction. And so this is basically, when we look at this, is that it's scaffolding of altruism, and we're going to talk about this a little bit. And so we intervene when your child behaves in a hurtful or negative way. So to use inductive discipline is really what's called positive discipline. And I know that seems like that doesn't fit together, but it's where the child takes responsibility for the outcome, and the child's included in the conflict management or finding solutions. So in other words, they feel like they are given the options. I heard today that you got into a little bit of a scuffle and that you pushed another child at school today. What do you think we should do about that? And even when children are 4, 5, and 6, even at those very young ages, to include them in the process of making things better, they feel like they have some sort of control over it. And so that actually even promotes, a lot of times can promote a pro-social or an altruistic behavior. And so I've seen where one time my daughter came home and a girl had scratched her, and when she came home, in her bag was a handwritten card that said, I'm sorry, and it had a smiley face on it, and be my friend. And so this other child had really taken it upon themselves, and obviously their parent had helped them do this, but that they had a hand in control over how they would make sure that that they kept their friend. So how else do we do it? Obviously that we model this pro-social behavior, and that as parents and as good citizens in our community, that we make sure that we look around and we see who is watching us, and so that we model these good behaviors too. We can model things like forgiveness. We can model things like, I don't know, letting somebody go ahead of us in line if we see that they're in a rush. We can model things like helping other people. And so, you know, again, this is all of the interventions that we can use to help really support and nurture the pro-social behaviors. So what happens when we don't have pro-social behaviors? Well, we can generally characterize this more as aggression. And so without these tools that we've given them for pro-social behavior, because don't forget, just like adults, you know, we have kind of our cognitive schemes. They're starting to make their cognitive schemes too. So they're starting to collect all their tools in their toolbox on how they should act out in public, how they should act around their friends, what's acceptable, what's not acceptable. And so if they don't have these tools to be able to maybe resolve conflicts or resolve problems or resolve issues, then a lot of times what we see is we see aggression. And how this is defined is any hostile or destructive act. Physical aggression peaks at about the age of 2.5. And kind of interesting, because I just talked to you about the little kid who whacked the other little kid on the head with the teddy bear, and then was kind of surprised when his friend cried. You know, but we have to remember that this is the time that they are starting to gauge, and they're starting to emotionally come into the world, and they're starting to put all of those things together in biologically, and also gauging things in the world as far as how people react to what they do. So I would expect this to be really, like I said, physical aggression peaks at about the age of 2. They're still kind of dealing with what Freud would consider the id or the kid. And so what we see from this age is we see a little bit more emotional or EQ coming into action, and where children, this kind of settles down, and they're starting to understand where they should be emotionally and how they should emotionally be behaving or acting in the world, so to speak. So declines with the onset of emotional regulation. So aggression declines with the onset of emotional regulation, maturing in the frontal lobes. Now there's different types of aggression that we do see in this age group. One is instrumental, and that's basically it's to gain access to something, to the toy, the space, or a privilege maybe with a care provider. Reactive, which is basically to harm another person either physically or verbal, and they don't often think about the consequences. Or relational, which tries to damage relationships. It could be a relationship of maybe another little child in class, and so, you know, they try to make everybody else not like another person. And it can even be to damage a relationship, maybe even between mom and dad, maybe even between a care provider. So these are just some of the other side of that we see a pro-social behavior, and that we have to understand that this does go on when a child doesn't have, you know, the modeling, or does not have the support to say, yes, you know, you're doing a good job with your behaviors. So let's look at what's motivated by behavior. Well, we already talked a little bit about instrumental aggression, or the different kinds, and it's acts that are actively instigated to achieve a goal. So it might be something like, I hit Tommy so I can get his toy. So the characteristics of this are that emotionally cool and more carefully planned. And the reactive aggression, an example of that would be, Jimmy took my toy, so I'm going to hit him. And then when we go down to direct aggression or relational aggression, it's carried out indirectly through damaging or destroying a victim's relationship. Sarah got a better grade than me, so I'm going to tell the teacher that she cheated. So those just give you a little bit of the examples of that. So what are some factors? So now that we do know that some kids have aggression, and we know that aggression is supported by a number of different factors, or what's happening and what's going on in a child's development. So what's contributing to aggression? Well, one can be a difficult temperament and may evoke a power assertion of disciplinary techniques. So in other words, we might see that if a child has a lot of corporal punishment at home, that they might be a little bit more aggressive. These are just some possibilities. I don't want you to take these as hardcore facts that, well, if a child is aggressively punished at home, that this is absolutely what we're going to see, because in some cases we see just the opposite, where a child is very withdrawn too. So it could also be rejection from the teachers and peers. That if a child gets frustrated, that they're not getting the right attention, that maybe they're not getting picked at gym time, and so they've been outcast, that they might feel more aggressive. And it might be that the child may possess a hostile attributional bias. And so also with the gender, it's related to more likely with boys than it is to be girls that are labeled as aggressive, even though now we do see a lot more girls in this situation and becoming more aggressive. Boys are more likely to have externalizing problems. And so these are just some facts that are associated with it that I wanted to tell you about. And so let's go into looking at the generally, as part of the development, we start to see gender separations, talking about the difference between boys and girls now. And it's kind of interesting that we do see a little bit more aggression in boys than girls, and then we also have higher indication of percentage of ADD and ADHD too. And remember, this possibly could go right back to that pruning that we had talked about. It can be the nurture. It can be, whatever culture they grow up in or the household that they grow up in. So we start to see this gender separation in childhood, and it's due in part to society, parents, socialization, environments, and schools. This is just, and sometimes schools and sometimes communities don't even realize that they're doing it, and they set things up differently. They'll set up a play area for boys, and they'll set up a play area for girls. I know that several years ago, and I was chaperoning a trip down into Chinatown, and I was really shocked because I looked down the street and there was another school that had all of their children kind of, I guess, on the same field trip as we were on. And they had the boys on the right-hand side and the girls on the left-hand side. And I would guess that they were about the age of 5 or 6. The boys, and they all had their school logos on their shirts. All of the boys had blue shirts on, and all of the girls had pink shirts on. So already they're starting to be categorized as you belong in pink and you belong in blue. And so there's different things that during this socialization period, there's a number of factors that are playing a role. And so when we look at the different types of play, we start looking at how are these children how are they nurtured. And so we look at how do they actually develop through their play. Well, we talk about boys and how they play rough and tumble, and a lot of times we have tomboys that like to do this too, but generally we find that when we look at the play areas and how they're set up, that there's more fantasy play or pretend play with girls than there is with boys, and we have the rough and tumble play. Now, in talking about rough and tumble play, this is not just, a lot of times this isn't even aggressive play. This is just boys, maybe tumbling around, kind of having a good time with each other, and not hurting each other. And so the rough and tumble play with boys a lot of times, and depending on the culture, depending on the household, depending on any time, is actually encouraged. Sometimes, it'll be where, dad wrestles with the young boy, and so they start to learn these sort of behaviors too. And again, it might be the whole point that the boys don't even engage in rough and tumble play. But we're not talking about sports, and we're not talking about being aggressive. We're talking about maybe being a little more assertive, and really not the intent to harm their friends at all. So let's look a little bit at the fantasy play, and this emerges at the end of the sensory motor stage. Initially, the parent scaffolds. In other words, the little girl might watch mommy and how she cooks or how mommy feeds the baby. And, boys might stand up beside dad when he's shaving, and he might start wondering about what it's like to shave. So we might see things like mommy's little helper, daddy's little helper. And so they start to understand their relationships, and they start to understand where they are socially, emotionally, through what they're getting a lot of with modeling, either from parents or at schools, or even directly from their peers too. So what are the benefits to all of these types of behaviors? Well, when we look at the value of pretend play is that, one, it allows the children to practice adult roles. Like I said, this is a lot of times where the boy might go in and find dad's shaving cream and put it on, and then just kind of see what it's like to have shaving cream on their face. It allows a child a sense of control, the control that they might actually be able to do this. They could feed a baby. And for those of you who have multiple children, a lot of times the big sister or big brother, they get to try to feed their younger sibling. And so it gives them a sense of control over being able to do these very adult things. So it furthers an understanding of social norms. And I say social norms, and I have to really go a little bit more into that. The social norms that are within a household or within a community, and that can mean many different things. The social norms might be that maybe if there's two mothers in a household, then the social norms might be to understand that each one of them has a particular role in that household. And so social norms there's not really a set standard for a social norm. It really is gauged by what that child experiences from their environment. So it also offers an adult world insight into what children may be thinking. So in other words, wondering about that shaving cream, does it really taste like whipped cream? Well, one taste of that, and they will quickly know that it does not taste like whipped cream. And then when we look at talking about the girls and boys play world, is that a lot of times this is gender segregated. Play is firmly entrenched by elementary school. In other words, we can see these differences. And many times this is nurtured. We start seeing now where schools are trying to make things more gender neutral, where girls can play maybe flag football, and that there's a sense of even team effort work. But a lot of times, even though here we are in 2015, the whole fact is that there are very specific gender roles sometimes, and we do get all of these differences. Whereas girls, a lot of times, they're more calm, they're more subdued in their play, and they have a more nurturing theme, and they play collaboratively and relate one-on-one. Whereas boys are more rambunctious, they might have superhero warrior themes, and they try to establish a dominance, and they enjoy the competition, and there's more gender-specific rules for play. Now, this also creates confusion on the other side. We always have to look at the shadow side of these things too, because what if we have a child that is growing up with a sense of that they're a boy and that they would really prefer to stay in a quiet setting? We have those shy kids, remember? So, they want to stay in the more quiet and the shy settings. So a lot of times even this segregation can cause a lot of confusion and can cause a lot of anxiety. So as educators and as parents, we have to understand how we can actually support each individual child. All right, so let's look at a little bit of what contributes to the gender stereotype play. Well, it could be biological underpinnings. We can even go back to evolutionary theory or evolutionary psychology and look at the fact that where some theorists believe that children had to be rough and or boys had to be rough and tumble because they had to learn how to engage in fighting because they were the hunters and they went out and they had to be able to defeat the animal or kill the animal. And so some would say that there's biological roots. And they would say that's the role of testosterone. Another one is socialization of gender-specific behaviors. Could be either cultural norms, social norms, or family norms. What's the traditional gender roles in their house? What do they see? What's modeled to them? And then it can also be impact of cognition. In other words, gender scheme theories. And what's expected of them? Is it expected that boys maybe put on chapstick, but they don't put on lipstick? Girls put on lip gloss, boys put on chapstick. And so they start gauging all of these things. And really you can see how, again, looking at the shadow side, how somebody who is growing up and maybe wants to try different things, how they might feel embarrassed if they want to do that. So, it's being on the lookout for how we can support each individual child development so that they grow up healthy and they grow up into the person that they are meant to be and that they feel comfortable in being. So, all right, so let's go on to the next one here. And, not yet. So during this stage, friends become an entity of which to gauge and judge themselves. So friendships become very, very important. So the core qualities are similarity, trust, and emotional support. Friendships stimulate personal development. So they help us learn to manage our emotions. In other words, they're modeling for each other too. And they help us handle the conflicts. They're always there for support. Because we have to remember that they spend, their days at school. So their friends are basically their support if they have any issues or conflicts. And friends protect and enhance the developing self. In other words, they can be there for the other person. They can offer empathy. And then they have common interests too. Oh, I love this princess book. Oh, I love that one too. Well, then they know that they're reading books that are good or that are acceptable, and they feel good that they've picked out a good book. Okay, so we have a few more slides left here. We're almost done. One of the issues that I wanted to talk about was popularity, because this comes up in pretty much every school setting. And as part of development and part of social gauging, popularity is a concern. I have some really interesting things to tell you about this. Is that first off, when we look at social skills are necessary. And so when we look at social skills, we might look at popular, which are the most liked, the average, which is the middle range, and then the rejected, which may be socially inept or may have internalizing or externalizing tendencies and may not fit in with the dominant group. And in many ways, this can actually be a good thing. So when do kids start to see who's popular and who's not? Well, this generally comes at around the second or the third grade. And this is when it becomes an issue. One of the reasons it becomes an issue is because, don't forget, we have different temperaments of these children. Some are very, very outgoing and make friends very quickly, and some are very shy and maybe do not make friends that quickly. But we have to remember, with girls and even with boys too, some of them don't want to have big packs of friends. Some of them want to have just that one or two best friends that they have a nice little cohort. And so we generally see all of these cliques starting to happen. Now, the biggest and the most important thing is that there's not one dominant clique that is trying to reject or do negative things to another one. And so if we do have these nice little microcosms of support, then, children, even depending on what their temperament is, will be highly successful in their socialization and in going through their school. Now, here's a very interesting fact of talking about the popularity, is that even with the popular, they can be either pro-social or anti-social. So a lot of times the most popular, it's like the cool kids, I guess whatever's in that song, which might be very outgoing, but it might be the ones that are very antisocial too. Ooh, they're dark and mysterious. And so, people want to be around them, or, it's like the bad boy or the bad girl in the class. And one thing that is actually linked to the most popular kids in the research is that these individuals actually have higher risky behaviors as they grow older. So just kind of some interesting facts about popularity, and really just to be able to be on the lookout for that, and what does that mean to kids. So looking at, now we come to the more antisocial personality, and we look at bullying. So a situation, what is bullying? We all have heard many different bullying ads on the TV because it's become such a big issue. So it's a situation in which one or more children or adults harass or target a specific child for systematic abuse. So it could be a group of children at school, but here is something that I also want you to factor in. Bullying can also happen from a teacher or a school administrator onto a child too. So we are also finding a lot of bullying going on this way. I was involved in a case where a teacher had made a boy stand in the classroom, and she knew that he had a medical condition and that he had to get to the bathroom when he needed to get to the bathroom. And she was particularly upset at him that day for whatever reason, and the teacher told him to just stand there. He said that he needed to use the restroom, and she said, "I don't care what you need to do." And eventually the boy wet himself, and she made him stand there in his own urine for the entire day in the back of the room while people passed him and demoralized him significantly. And so, of course, there was a court case on it, and she's no longer a teacher, but we can see how bullying is not just child on child. And so, a lot of times parents or caregivers really need to be on the lookout for if something is happening in the child's demeanor, that harassment might not be coming from another child, but might actually be coming from an adult at the school too. So it can happen that way too. So there's different categories. The bully victim, which is exceptionally aggressive children who repeatedly get bullied and get victimized. So many demonstrate both externalizing and internalizing tendencies. And this may not hang on a minute, I lost my spot. Okay, here we go. And then the other one is the classic victim, which is generally internalizing, and it is where the kids are more anxious and shy, and so they might also be lower on the social hierarchy, and it's unlikely that they will fight back. So bullies often find the individuals who they think that they can dominate in some way. In other words, they don't generally bully somebody that they figure is at their own level or is a competition for them. So we have a lot of different programs now that talk about bullying, and of course these are very important. And I think the one in the YouTube too was the bully prevention program, where administrators are working with students to form a school-wide norm for intolerance of bullying. So the idea of these bullying interventions is not to, put all of these kids that have been bullied in a karate class and make it so that they can stick up for themselves. That's not what these intervention programs do. What they really do is they're there to educate the parents to educate the kids, and to educate, especially to educate the students too. Because the idea is to have positive interactions within the school. So they have to, if they just go in and they regulate this and they teach other children how to be aggressive, this is defeating the entire purpose of really getting the bullying out of school, period. So they want to try to start to change all of the behaviors of all of the kids to understanding that it's not acceptable behaviors. What can we do? Because we also have to remember sometimes those that bully have had things going on themselves, and sometimes that can stem to the fact that they were bullied or that they were victimized at one time. So it's really to look at the whole big picture of it, and to educate maybe parents of shy children, and then to foster secure attachments during preschool, and then to also make sure that kids have friends at school. When new kids come into school, that they're not picked on, that they get a buddy, just like some of you have talked about. And that also to look at parents, or to look at children with externalizing disorders, that to be able to teach parents maybe how to show more loving and sensitive displays, to minimize that power assertion, and to teach emotional regulation skills and reattribution of the bias. In other words, to really take into consideration a holistic view of what's going on, and to try to make positive connections at school between the kids, but also to educate the public and to educate the parents as well. Okay, so that concludes Chapter 6, and I will see you in Chapter 7.